All right. Well, we're going to talk about the rise of Islam. Why would we talk about the rise of Islam in a course titled The History of Christianity? Why?
Several crusades.
Well, that's right, because later on we're going to talk about the Crusades. We can't understand the Crusades without understanding the rise of Islam.
It was just a Christian heresy to begin with. I mean, according to a lot of Christians, it was just another heresy.
A Christian heresy. That would make a great research topic.
Sure would, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it's too late to think about that. In what sense, Jace, would Islam be a Christian heresy?
There was a lot of Christian influence in Muhammad's region at the time, and a lot of those Christian influences were heretical. And if you look at Islam, it's really just a compilation of multiple Christian heresies. And a lot of people, when it first rose up, like Saint John of Damascus, a lot of his writing, it was just another heresy to him. It wasn't viewed as a religion, even by him. Kind of an interesting topic.
All right, very good. Sorry, I swallowed wrong, and now I'm all choked up. But Jace is really going to help us out to understand the influence of Christian heresies on Islam, because that's the topic of his paper. Okay, so this is something that interests you, and it should. You'll be able to learn more from his paper. There are also a couple of other papers on this topic. Eric is doing his paper on Muhammad, and then Adrian is talking about the advance of Islam from the death of Muhammad up to the time of the Crusades. So we have three papers related to the topic today, so you'll have opportunities to learn a lot more about that. All right, very good. Well, one reason to study Islam is we're going to see it had a huge impact on the history of the Christian church. A devastating impact, I will say. Islam, as a word, means submission. Arabic word that means to submit. We're going to find out later when we get into the pillars how that submission works its way out in the lives of the followers of Islam, the Muslims. Let's talk about the background. Began, of course, in Arabia, among the Arabian inhabitants that were polytheistic star worshippers. There were up to 400 of these idols, these false gods, probably influenced by the Magi in Persia. And there was a lot of influence from from Christians and Jews. All right. So, oops, I didn't mean to go that far. So, a number of Jewish and Christian immigrants in Arabia that had influence in this area. The culture was a Bedouin tribal society. They recognized Abraham as their forebear, and so you see how they certainly were connected to Judaism and also to Christianity, both of whom recognized Abraham as one of the spiritual forefathers. There were a few population centers, of course. It's a desert area, but Mecca was their holy city, even before Islam. Mecca was the center of their worship. All right, Muhammad. Whoa. Muhammad is probably hopefully in your notes. Muhammad is spelled differently. Muhammad can be spelled probably multiple ways. Most words transliterated from Arabic are that way. And it can be spelled with an M-O, H-A-M-M-E-D, or an M-U, H-A-M-M-A-D. And I typically, this must have been one of my early renditions of these notes, because after learning from Dr. Mike Edens, I generally have switched over to the M-U spelling. According to Dr. Edens, and he is my best resource for all things Islamic, because Dr. Edens spent over 20 years in Egypt and Iraq with Muslims, and also, of course, he teaches Islamic studies here. But he tells me that Muhammad with an O means that Muhammad is given praise. Muhammad with an M-U means Muhammad gives praise. So it's not much of a difference, but slight difference there in the meaning. He was born in 570 in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. He was the son of a young widow. In fact, I believe his father died even before he was born.
When she was pregnant.
Okay, while she was pregnant, his father died. So he was a member of the Quraysh tribe. They were descendants, they considered themselves descendants of Ishmael, the priests of the local religion of 360 gods. We believe he was epileptic, and at about 20 years of age, he entered the mercantile service of Khadijah, who was a wealthy widow. 5 years later, he married Khadijah. She was 40 years old at the time, and she was his only wife until after her death. Then, later he being a polygamist, and Islam being a polygamous religion, he had up to 10 wives. He and Khadijah had 4 daughters, but only Fatima survived him. All right, I'm more comfortable now. In 611, Muhammad had a vision, and in this vision, it was his belief that Gabriel came to him to appoint him to call his people back to the worship of one true God, Allah, and that monotheistic worship that his father Abraham had practiced. All right, when historians think that perhaps this vision was associated with epilepsy, and Muhammad himself believed that he had been approached by a demon. He himself thought at the beginning that he was demon-possessed when he had this vision. The Arabic word would be jinn, J-I-N-N. We translate that as genies. But nonetheless, Khadijah, his wife, supported him and convinced him that indeed this was not a demon, wasn't a jinn, it wasn't a seizure. It was a genuine visitation from an angel. And so he finally accepted the visions as a sign that he was the divinely appointed prophet of Allah. So he began to preach the worship of one God, Allah, His first converts were, of course, his wife, and then his cousin Ali, and then a wealthy Meccan merchant by the name of Abu Bakr. And these became very important. These two men became very important in the progression of Islam. Well, he had little success at first because the idea of monotheism not only attacked the current belief in many gods, but it also had an impact on the trade in idols. All right, we remember that Paul had a similar problem in Ephesus when he preached Christ. People in Ephesus began to turn away from the worship of Artemis. There was a reduction in the trade of silver statues of Artemis, and so there was a big protest from an economic point of view, couched in religious terms. So the same way here, that the lucrative idol-making industry, the tourist trade from pilgrims journeying to Mecca, that was all being affected, and so they did not respond well to Muhammad. 619, Khadijah died, and up to then, Khadijah, because of her wealth and her prestige and her prominence as a merchant, she had been able to protect Muhammad from the criticism. But after she died, Muhammad then was accused of sorcery and fraud. A few years later, he was invited to move to Yathrib, and later on Yathrib was renamed Medina. So a very important city in the history of Islam. In fact, what we call 622 AD is zero in the Muslim calendar. This experience, this exodus, so to speak, to Medina is called the Hijra, and it is now the focal point of Muslim calendars. So a very important event in the history of Islam. The Yathrib was the power base there was Jewish. There were three powerful Jewish tribes. There were wealthy merchants. Arabs were actually more numerous, but the Jews had the political and economic power. Arabs were used as labor force. And once in Medina, Muhammad really was acknowledged as the leader with divine authority. And he led a coalition of Jews and Arabs in their endeavors. And mostly what they were doing was not only were they conducting trade, but they also were raiding other caravans. But he established a community that was based on a charter of faith and not old tribal loyalties. What's important about this is that the Arabs had been a kind of a diverse, disparate multitude of different tribes worshiping different gods, but with his establishment of monotheism, he was able to bring these different members of tribes together into one unit, and that made them quite a force politically, militarily, and religiously. So this was a community based on a charter of faith, not old tribal loyalties. So again, we see a powerful leader using religion as a cement to hold people together in some kind of unity. All right? We see this over and over again, but we're seeing it here in the Arabian Peninsula with Islam as the cement. Muhammad accepted his roots from Abraham. He took on the Jewish practice of praying toward a holy city. Originally, he prayed toward Jerusalem, and that was the intention. That was the first revelation, I should say, among the early revelations from Allah was the command to pray toward Jerusalem. But during one of the significant battles, it's the Battle of Trench in 627, the Jews deserted Muhammad. And so when Muhammad won that battle, he turned his hostility toward the Jews, and he received a new revelation from Allah that instead of praying toward Jerusalem, those who followed Allah would pray toward Mecca. Okay? This is called Qibla, the direction of prayer that you desire. Okay? Qibla, this revelation of praying toward a holy city, and the holy city being Mecca. Okay? Well, Muhammad was able to conquer Mecca, fighting 3 battles in 624, 625, 627 is this Battle of Trench I just mentioned. Finally, he defeated Mecca in 629. And when he defeated Mecca, he actually entered the city, but they begged him to leave, and then went in without pillaging the city. And then if he would return, then they proclaimed him as their ruler. So that was that. He did that. He left and then returned on a pilgrimage, was proclaimed the ruler of Mecca and the head of the Arabian Peninsula. However, he did, even though he made a pilgrimage to Mecca, was proclaimed as ruler there, he remained in Medina, and he died in 632. Eric, do you have anything to add to that biography? That's really pretty sketchy.
Yeah, I've got, my research show a lot of different things. I guess one of the biggest things that you didn't talk about is the Kaaba, which is the base in Mecca, and it's, I noticed you have a picture of one on your slides of it. But it's the big cube that they worshipped, and they had idols from all over were in this cube, and that's why Mecca was such a holy town. And so that's where all the pilgrims came, to that cube. And that's what the direction that they pray at now. When you're in Medina, you still pray at that cube, or the Kaaba. And that was one of the main disagreements when he was saying there's just one God. That's where all the economical things that come with having all the people coming to you, and then you're saying there's only one God. I guess that was the root of a whole lot of the battles and getting kicked out of Mecca. Yeah, I guess that's a big it. And then, yeah,
Okay.
that was about it. Then the battles, what I got from the battles are a little bit different. It was, I think, 27, he made a treaty with Mecca and the people of Mecca, and then in 29, actually one Meccan killed a Muslim. Everybody thought it was a personal matter why he killed him, but Muhammad took that as a breach of the treaty, and then walked right into Mecca and took everything over, which was, like you said, a very bloodless conqueror of the city, but it was kind of just one of those that trying to figure out, it's still hard to figure out the real meaning. We have to get 2 different sides of that story. So.
Okay. Well, thanks. Thanks for that. All right. So there's always more to learn. That's why I have you post your research projects on the discussion board so that we all can learn more from each other. All right.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
I do have one more
yes,
thing
sure,
about
please.
I forgot about the when he in 11 when he saw the vision of the angel. One thing that I thought was very odd to my point was he says that he felt the darkness come over him and almost to the point of suffocation, and then he ran out of the cave. He was in the cave when he goes to visit, so he ran out of the cave trying to get back home, and that's when he saw the angel again, and that's when the angel said it was Gabriel, and it told him that he had the mission to preach that there is one God. And so that one was just looking at that, and then looking at his heritage and all the other angelic visions in the Old Testament. I just thought it was very odd that, first he felt in danger and in pain, and then also there was, in all the stuff I read, the angel did not say, do not be afraid. But all the other visions from Abraham and everybody else in the Bible, one of the first things the angel says is, do not be afraid. And so it's just a big contrast between all the other angelic visions in the Bible.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Eric. Interesting point. Boy, this is really off the subject, and I will not follow this rabbit long. But speaking of do not be afraid, of course, as Eric is saying, this is from angels, but all the way through the Bible, there's encouragements in the Word of God about be not afraid, and in fact, it says it 366 times, and I learned this from studying about Richard Wurmbrand. Of course, we won't. I don't know that we even talk about Richard Wurmbrand in the other half of this, but certainly someone who suffered for the sake of Christ in communist Romania. I'm writing an article on him right now, why that just popped into my head. But anyway, thanks, Eric, for reminding us that when the angels appear in the Scripture, they say, "Be not afraid." But when the angel appeared to Muhammad,
he thought he was going to die. He thought he was going to be suffocated.
Yeah. All right. Well, as Muhammad experienced these revelations from the angel, supposedly representing Allah, over a 20-year period, he recorded these revelations, and they make up the Quran. And again, we have two spellings. I grew up, spelling it K-O-R-A-N. It seems that more learned transliterations have the Q-U-R with the apostrophe A-N. But nonetheless, the Quran is the sacred writings of Islam. Abu Bakr, we just saw his name as one of the early converts, the wealthy merchant in the area, and was Muhammad's successor. He ordered that these revelations and oral traditions be preserved. And they're written in Arabic, which is the true language of Allah. But of course, nowadays, there are translations of the Quran in multiple languages. Quran teaches one God, Allah, and the final revelation of His will, which completes the work of the prophets. So, according to the Quran, there are other books, other peoples of the book. The Jews and the Christians have their prophets. But Muhammad is the final prophet, and the Quran is the completion of the revelation of God's will. Now, there are other sacred writings known as the Hadith. These are more practical instructions. They read more like Proverbs. Most of the Orthodox Hadith were compiled by two men, Al-Bukhari and a man named Muslim. All right, that's kind of confusing. When you see that name, you think, oh, it's written by a Muslim. No, it's written by a man named Muslim and another one named Al-Bukhari. There are about 13,000 of them, and 3,000 of them are shared in common between these two sources. All right, Islam recognizes that there are other peoples of the book. The Jews have, of course, the Hebrew Bible, and the Christians have the New Testament. Christians and Jews are treated as second-class citizens. When an Islam force took over a region, any Arabs who had been pagan, who had been these polytheistic star worshippers, they were forced to convert to Islam. However, if there were Jews and Christians in that region, they were allowed to continue worshiping according to their faith, but they were treated as second-class citizens and forced to pay higher taxes. Now, here's something interesting. Jason's already talked about how some of these fringe Christians, these heretical Christians, had influenced Muhammad to begin with. Well, there were situations in which some of these fringe Christians actually welcomed the Muslims into their area, because you remember that when Nestorius was banished after the Council of Ephesus in 431, that he went back to Antioch in Syria, and he had his own followers that began what they call the Church of the East. We look at it as the Nestorian Church, but nonetheless, the Nestorians still existed in the Eastern Empire. Then also, after the last week, Mark taught you about the other councils, the fifth and sixth councils, where they dealt with the Monophysites, those who taught that Christ only had one nature. Well, the Monophysites and the Nestorians, even though they differed from each other, they also differed from the Orthodox Christians based in Constantinople. And so Constantinople harassed these fringe Christians, what we call heretical Christians, to the extent that they actually felt like they would be better treated under Islamic rule. And so many of them assisted the Muslims as they overran their territories. In terms of the second-class citizenship, there was Islamic protection was offered to the Jews and the Christians, but that came with a price. And that price was outlined in what we call the Pact of Umar. Umar was the caliph, was one of the, after the death of Muhammad, was the second ruler, and he created a pact with the Christians. It was unilateral. You know, it wasn't that the Christians were able to negotiate. It's just that this is what he said they would allow for the Christians. All right, and I'm just going to. There's really a number of issues in this pact, but I'll just outline a few of them. One, we shall not build new monasteries, churches, convents, monks' cells, nor shall we repair by day or by night such of them as fall in ruins or are situated in the quarters of the Muslims. All right, so catch this: no new buildings, no repair of the old buildings. So any property owned by Christians in Muslim territories cannot be repaired. So as they fall into disrepair, they fall into disuse. All right? We shall not manifest our religion publicly, nor convert anyone to it. And we shall not prevent any of our kin from entering Islam if they wish it. So according to the Pact of Umar, Christians can convert their offspring, but they cannot convert anyone else. And they cannot prevent their offspring from converting to Islam. We shall show respect toward the Muslims. We shall rise from our seats when they wish to sit. We shall not seek to resemble the Muslims by imitating any of their garments, their cap, the turban, footwear, parting of the hair, so on and so forth. We shall shave the fronts of our heads. We shall not display our crosses or our books in the roads or markets of the Muslims. We shall use only clappers, which are wooden noisemakers that were used to call people to worship in our churches very softly. So they can't ring church bells anymore. They can just stand at the door and clap wooden clappers. In Israel, the only place where I ever heard church bells were in Jerusalem. They're allowed in Jerusalem, but nowhere else. However, Muslim mosques everywhere uh, broadcast the call to prayer 5 times a day. And if they would do it live, at least it would sound pleasant. But since they're just broadcasting a recording, it really is one of the ugliest sounds that you can ever imagine. Also, they love to build their mosques right next to Christian places of worship, as well as Jewish synagogues. But if there is a Christian holy place, there's going to be a mosque right there, broadcasting their call to prayer 5 times a day. But Christians and Jews are limited in those territories that are Islamic. All right, Muslims are those who submit to the will of the one true God and His written word, and their leaders are laymen who understand God's word and interpret it. There is direct access to God's word. There's no rites, no sacraments from the priests. Simple plan of salvation through obedience and good works. Sin problem, according to Islam, is not human rebellion against God. Instead, the problem is ignorance, and the solution is knowledge. Therefore, in Islam, Muhammad is not equivalent to Jesus. The Quran is the equivalent of Jesus. The Quran is the source of salvation because it explains how to live in right relationship with God. Islam teaches a human free will, the sovereignty of Allah. There's no total depravity. Humanity is basically good. Allah is sovereign, read capricious, and He forgives whom He chooses. There is no assurance of salvation, only fear of God. And this is illustrated by an encounter that one of my friends had in Israel. Our former chief of police was Barry Busby. If you knew him, you probably knew him by his name Hoot. Hoot is now a chaplain in the Army. But when we were there in Israel, Hoot got involved in a conversation with a Muslim, and Hoot said, "Tell me how to know that I'm going to paradise." And of course the Muslim could not answer because there is no assurance. And so then he became belligerent. And his only answer was fear Allah and His messenger. Is the way of salvation. Fear Allah and His messenger. So the emphasis in Islam is on honor and shame. It's not on guilt and innocence. There are 5 pillars in Islam. The first is confession of faith. And that is, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is His messenger. And then they pray 5 times a day. Prayer is a submission of time. We talk about submission of time. So they, and then the 5 times a day, then at noon on Friday, there's a community prayer at the mosque. This is interesting. Of the 5 times, the first one is in the morning, and the time of prayer is that time when one can distinguish between a white thread and a black thread. So as it just becomes light enough to distinguish white thread from black thread, that is the time for the first daily prayer. Actually, the 5 times are morning, noon, mid-afternoon, sunset, and the evening meal. And according to my source, the mid-afternoon and the evening meal are not observed in all communities. All right, the 5 pillars. Gifts to care for the needy is a submission of resources. Fasting in the holy month of Ramadan is the submission of mind and body. And then the 5th pillar is the pilgrimage to Mecca, the submission to the true community of God in the world, drawn from all nations. And here is an image of the Kaaba, as Eric referred to it. And supposedly within this this cube is a meteor about the size of a cannonball that fell from the sky, and of course symbolized the worship of the stars for the centuries. But it is still there, housed in this cube that is the focal point of Islam, and I believe once in a lifetime every Muslim is expected to come and have a pilgrimage here to Mecca.
I did find a cell phone video from inside of the Kaaba on YouTube, so if anybody's interested to see.
Okay.
The meteorite is disputed among Muslims too, I found. A lot of people will believe that it was a meteorite, and other people say that was just a myth of the sand from prehistoric times.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Eric. All right, there are other Islamic principles. All right, we hear a lot about jihad, and what does that mean? Well, it is literally means exertion or effort, and in the broad sense, there is an exertion for piety. But in another sense, there's a submission of community to the pattern of Medina, and in the narrow sense, then, this submission can be enforced through holy war, this armed struggle to advance Islam. And so that's why we see or hear the term jihad in relationship to what the Islamic terrorists are doing. They're conducting holy war. They're conducting jihad against the infidels, those who who do not follow Islam, and it is an armed struggle to advance Islam. All right, Sharia is the way, and that is Islamic law. And oh yes, Jace?
Back to jihad real quick. There's actually an account in the Hadith in which Muhammad himself says that they'd just come back from a battle,
Mm-hmm.
and Muhammad is explaining the difference between the greater jihad and the lesser jihad. He supposedly said that the greater jihad is the struggle for obedience to God, and the lesser jihad is the physical exertion, is the war. And that's a huge push among Muslims to say that Islam is a peaceful religion, because it is the lesser jihad that wages war, but the greater jihad that wages for that inner peace, wages for that obedience.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, of course, that works to some extent. That defense of Islam works only to the extent that they are not using the lesser jihad to wage war and to wage terror in an attempt to spread Islam. But good point. I appreciate that.
I'm not saying that I agree with that. I'm just saying that
That is their defense.
That is defense.
That is their defense of jihad as a term. That the greater jihad is the inner submission. Right.
From what I read from the Muslim perspective, they almost use it as a point of being able to defend themselves. When there is any kind of persecutor against Islam, they then have the right to defend themselves. And so that's kind of the way they defined it as to themselves.
Okay.
And even in instances of sharing the gospel with Muslims and explaining to them the peace that I have, even in death,
Mm-hmm.
Knowing that whether I live or die, I get to experience a relationship with God, and so there is no fear in death. So I don't mind being in a perilous situation if it means sharing the gospel with someone who could be harmful to me. There's no fear in that, and they said that's jihad. That's exactly what jihad is. And I'm like, no, I don't think that you understand. But that again, even whenever I'm sharing the gospel with Muslims, that's kind of their view of it. They view that as the same thing as us going in, dying, and that's more of a martyrdom.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, they would view evangelism of Islam, if you want to call it that. I don't like to call it that, but the push of Islam and the faith of one people, they would view that as jihad as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, and of course, I'm I remember, just a few weeks ago, we talked about Augustine's view of just war. And it's very similar to this in that Augustine taught that coercion of faith was effective because it was better to have faith forced on someone than for that person to die as a heretic. So, and then also when we get to the Crusades, we'll find out that the popes, Pope Urban and then the other popes, used this idea of holy war to encourage the Crusades. So we really see some mutual influences back and forth at this time. It's a lot of challenges and difficulties in dealing with these issues of faith from this time period. So different from where we are and how we live and how we understand the Bible today. Craig?
Yes, sir. Is there or has there ever been a period in which there were severely persecuted against, I guess, like the Christian church was?
Well, I would say probably the Crusades come to mind. That is a time when there was war between the Crusaders and the Muslims. Who started that conflict? Well, in my opinion, the Muslims started the conflict, but certainly the response of the Crusaders, and I call them Crusaders rather than Christians, because that's I think the broader, more generic term. So I would say that the response of the Crusaders was very extreme, very violent, very brutal. So in that sense, yes, there was a time when at least they were warred against. They were not, and then we can look ahead to the time of the Inquisition, particularly in Spain, because, of course, as we're going to see, Muslims pushed into Spain and conquered it, and then later on the Christians retook Spain, but there were still those who were Muslims in that area. And under the Spanish Inquisition, those who were Muslims were either forced to convert to Christianity, or they were thrown into prison or even executed. So there was that period of time as well.
And there were also a lot of warring back and forth between them and Hindus, especially in Pakistan and Bangladesh area. I have a friend from Bangladesh, and he said it's just always constant over there, especially at the border.
Right, contemporary.
India, Bangladesh.
So talking right now, in our time frame, we see wars between Muslims and Hindus in India, Bangladesh, so in that region. Yes, there's a long history of religious wars. So that's just a part of the fact of the history of civilization. Sharia is the way, Islamic law, and there are places where there is a union of Islam and the state. Saudi Arabia is one of those, Iran is one. There are other places where we have a secular Islamic government. Turkey is an example. Tunisia was an example before the upheaval there. I think the government there is unsettled, but I was in Tunisia in March of 2005, and at that time it was very clearly a secular Islamic state where, yes, there was a state religion, Islam, but Christianity was not specifically illegal. Conversion of Muslims was illegal. And that's the way it is actually in Turkey. Technically, even conversion is not illegal, but there still is persecution of Christians there, but mostly through mob action. I say in Turkey it's a pretty clear secular Islamic state, but in Iran the government is based on the Quran. It is Sharia, and to be other than Islamic is to violate Sharia, the Islamic law.
Isn't that a new development for that country, though? Like
Iran? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't always,
1979.
yeah.
Right. When the Shah of Persia was overthrown by the forces under the influence of Ayatollah Khomeini, and of course the American hostages were taken, and then since then, from 1979 until now, it has been under Sharia.
Was there, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Was there an example of an older government like in this time period that was run by Sharia law? Like, was that the first country that was actually run by Sharia law in a traditional way like that? Is my question. Does that make sense?
No. Ask it one more time.
Is there an example of a previous country that was run like Iran is run today? That you can think of?
Muhammad pretty much conquered all of Arabia by the time it was dead, but I don't know much about how it was ran.
I would say really all of the territories under Islamic rule were ruled by Sharia. I think it's more in more modern times. In some countries, Sharia has given way to a secular Islamic state. I would say sometime in the 20th century. My history gets really fuzzy after the Reformation, but probably it was during the Ottoman Empire, or at least in the aftermath of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire was overthrown because it allied itself with Germany and lost. After that, much of what had been part of the Ottoman Empire came under the protection of, or the authority of Britain or France.
Okay.
So I would say that as those countries then regained, as Muslims regained control, probably in some states, for the most part, it was secular Islamic rule. But then after the Shah was overthrown, then we have Sharia in Iran, and I'm not sure about Saudi Arabia. Okay. All right. A number of messengers, 3 to 4 messengers, included Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. Possibly David is considered the 4th messenger by some. Up to 2,600 prophets, including Old Testament figures, New Testament figures, even some Hindus are considered prophets. Their theology includes a final resurrection and judgment, angels and demons, eternal life in paradise or hell. There is no priesthood, and there's an equality of all men. These are other Islamic principles. And then polygamy. Muhammad had 10 wives. Muslims are allowed a maximum of 4 wives, all to be treated equally, okay, according to this principle. There are multiple divisions within Islam, but there are 2 major divisions. First, we have the Sunnis. These are centered in Arabic tradition. They emphasize the Quran. They emphasize the tradition or the Sunnah of the Prophet found in the Hadith, those sayings attributed to Muhammad. The Sunnah, which is kind of a plural term, includes the biography of Muhammad, the Hadith, and the Quran. Sunnah is a word that was used to be the traditional safe route from oasis to oasis. In other words, if you're traveling in a caravan in the desert, you have to know the shortest, truest way to the next oasis. That's the Sunnah. All right? In the same sense, following the traditional Islamic Sunnah is important in order to get to your destination. So there's an abhorrence of deviation because of the danger to the community. 90% of Muslims are Sunnis. That's 1.5 billion Sunnis. The next largest group of the Shiites, there's actually 150 million Shiites, and most of them are in Iran. Shiites are person-centered. They teach that religious leaders must be descendants of Muhammad and must be worthy. These are actually, the Shiites are more volatile than the Sunnis because they're centered around personalities, while Sunnis are centered around tradition. So tradition is slower to change, but personalities, obviously, they can change things quickly if they get the following. And of course, this leader is known as an Ayatollah. He's considered a doctor or a teacher of Islamic law, and they can change directions radically. And the great example is Ayatollah Khomeini when he took over in Iran. Part of the tradition among the Shiites is the idea of the hidden imam. This is the true imam, the last descendant of Muhammad, and he's going to return one day. So this is similar to the idea of the Jewish Messiah. And each Ayatollah could be the hidden imam, and so each Ayatollah has great authority because he might be the one. All right, another group is the Sufis, and they're more mystical Muslims. But next we're going to talk about the spread of Islamic power, and again, Adrian is doing his paper on this topic. But the key to remember is that because of Muhammad, because of the glue of Islam, these scattered tribes all united as one political, military, religious force, and they were a power to contend with. And they spread rapidly. In 638, they took Jerusalem. By 640, they had mastered the entire region. You see a picture there of the Dome of the Rock. It was built around 690. It commemorates Muhammad's ascension into heaven after his night journey to Jerusalem. There's this tradition that in a vision, Muhammad mounted a winged horse that took off from Mecca and landed in Jerusalem and then ascended into heaven. And supposedly it was at this spot. So there's this Dome of the Rock was built. The rock that is located in this place, according to Judaism, is the rock where, on top of Mount Moriah, where Abraham offered Isaac. According to Islamic tradition, Abraham offered Ishmael at this spot. And this spot later became the resting place for the Ark of the Covenant. I have been to the Temple Mount, and I've seen the Dome of the Rock 4 times, but never been inside. Dr. Parker, Dr. Griffin, others have been inside. They have seen the rock, and there is a rectangular indention in the rock that they believe was the place where the ark rested during the time of the temple. Now, the dome itself is interesting. It is identical to the dome that is on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, same dimensions. The difference is, of course, that it's covered over with gold plate. So it is symbolic of the superiority of Islam over Christianity. And of course, the fact that the Dome of the Rock is built at the site of the Jewish temple symbolizes the conquest Judaism. Notice the octagonal design. This is interesting. Christian churches in the early centuries were often built in the octagonal design because the number 8 symbolizes the day of resurrection. Because Jesus, entered Jerusalem. The triumphal entry was Sunday. He was crucified on Friday and rose again on Sunday, which would have been the 8th day. So the number 8 is significant in Christian churches, and so it's been suggested that the Dome of the Rock was designed by a Christian architect, and they got this Christian symbol built into it. All right, so this is Jerusalem. 640, they invaded Egypt. By 695, they mastered North Africa. They conquered the Persian Empire. 649, 652, they took over what was then Asia Minor, now is Turkey. And in 711, they invaded Spain. Having crossed North Africa, they went on up into Spain. Yes, Josh?
What do these conquests look like? Are they sort of like mass movements of people? Or are they, I mean, since this isn't necessarily a country or like a sovereign state, it's a religion, so were they led by some like generals and moved like regular armies? Okay, so it wasn't like riots and mobs?
No. It was a military takeover. They did have a number of very successful generals. And no, it's not like, it was, by this time, the Arabian Peninsula had unified as a nation. So they were moving, into these areas. Don't think of it as Islamic terrorists now, where they're everywhere and they're nowhere. It was a very unified base of operation in the Arabian Peninsula, and they were moving out militarily from these territories. Of course, as I said, there were some places where the Christians felt like they'd get a better deal as second-class citizens under Islam than they were getting as persecuted sects under Constantinople. So in some cases there was cooperation there. 732, Charles Martel stopped the advance of Islam at Tours. But in 100 years, Islam had moved from the Arabian Peninsula north into Palestine and Syria and on up into Asia Minor and north. They moved east into Persia, and then they moved west across Egypt, across North Africa, and then across the strait here into Spain. 100 years, they advanced rapidly.
Dr. Weldon?
Yes.
Why do you think it was able to spread so fast from North Africa and it wasn't able to penetrate Europe, at least where the church was?
Well, of course, the church was here. I mean, when you think about the church, remember the where were the
Antioch?
Antioch and Alexandria. Remember how strong they were? Carthage, the home of Tertullian, Cyprian, Augustine, not to mention Perpetua and Felicitas. They were able to expand militarily, but the question is, why did the church fade so quickly from these areas? They were given, they were not forbidden to practice Christianity. They were marginalized and persecuted in the sense of taxation. But if you remember how the Christians responded to persecution from the Roman Empire, North Africa was like the Church of the Martyrs. And they proclaimed their faith in spite of much greater persecution than just higher taxes. So, there's been a lot of question about, well, first of all, to answer your first question, they advanced because of military power. But once they took over, they were able to either persuade or the Christians just kind of capitulated for a couple of reasons. Number one, after Constantine, we had the union of church and state. And so the pastors were supported by the state. Once the state was no longer Christian, the pastors were no longer supported, the priests and the bishops. They no longer received support from the state. Therefore, they left. They went back to Europe, leaving the people without a shepherd. All right? Remember, after 384, the official word of God was in what language? Latin. Right? Once these people quit speaking Latin, they didn't have the word of God in their own language. The Catholic Church had forbidden the translation of the Bible from Latin into any other language. So they didn't have the word, they didn't have any shepherds, and so it just became easier to capitulate to Islam than to stand up to the pressure. That's really one of the tragedies of the takeover of Islam, in that Christianity lost some of its most vital centers of worship and teaching and doctrine. All right? And of course today people aren't even aware of the Christian tradition that really preceded Islam. Yes, James?
It's maybe more of a military question than an issue question. As far as I understand it, Arabia is desolate almost. I mean, I'm trying to wrap my brain around, how do you get an army, how do you get a military force that strong to do that in 100 years when your base of operation is like wasteland? I can't. Is there historical evidence to talk about how he does that?
There was a lot of caravans that came from Africa and then went all the way through. And so that was just a big highway that everything went through, and they did a lot of caravan raids. And so that's like, going back to Muhammad, they went from completely poor, had one caravan raid, and they went to, being set. So you could just do one little thing like that and get your wealth all over it. So that's what I think of it. I don't know if you have anything different, but.
Well, just to comment on the wealth of the region, and again, I'm not a military expert. All right, I'm mainly just my interest in Islam is mostly its impact on the Christian Church. I'm not an expert on the history of Islam, but I do know that there was a great trade route from Yemen up to Palestine. It's called the Spice Route, and it actually originated in India. They would sail to Yemen, and then they would have this trade route that would go through Saudi Arabia and would end up here at Gaza. And then they would go from there to Europe, particularly to Venice, and then Venice then would have the trade there. I know this because I've been in Avdot, which is part of the spice trade route, and that's really where I learned about that. So I think, kind of piggybacking on Eric's statement, there was, even though this is desolate, there's a lot of wealth that comes from trade and commerce, and that wealth then would feed them, provide them with the military tools that they need. And again, even though it was the population was spread pretty far out because of the desert area, there were some main concentrations of population, but once they were united, then they were able to, amass a military force. So I'm not sure how they did it, but history tells us that they did. So, and it had tremendous impact on the Christian church, and that's really where we close. We have the loss of major Christian holy places, including Carthage. Then we have opposition to Christianity in some key places: Africa, Spain, Persia, and Eastern Europe. So Christianity then spread along a north-south axis. So we have Christianity strong in Italy, in the Frankish kingdom, of course that's the Holy Roman Empire, Germany, on into the British Isles. That's where Christianity has its strength, and it's kind of prevented from spreading westward or eastward by the presence of Islam. And so we have Western Christendom is separated from Constantinople. And ultimately we have of course, the Crusades. And the Crusades then generate their own set of influences on the history of Christianity. All right, any other questions? Well, obviously the history of Islam and its interaction with Christianity has tremendous implications for our lives today, because the animosity of Islam against Christianity is certainly expressed in a number of violent ways. And there's hostility from the West toward Islam as well. And so it's important for us to kind of understand the origins and the history of it, and particularly, of course, as we get into the Crusades, that will be another great puzzle piece in the history of the relationship of these two religions. But it really has become a major issue in our contemporary society.